prisoner directed the crime partners to go to the home of victim Gary Allen Hinman and have him sign over his property.
Did that affect your mind in some way, the sonic?
It was crushing my head and they were using sonic pressure.
Interviewing serial killers is a high-stakes game. Push too far, and things can spiral fast. These notorious figures thrive on control, and even a hint of disrespect can trigger a dangerous response. In this video, we'll cover the times serial killers completely flipped out at interviewers.
I come from hard times, bologna for Sunday dinner. I come from the Depression.
You come from not knowing your father?
I know my father. My father's all men.
Charles Manson. In 1986, Charles Manson, a notorious figure with a chilling past, sat down for an interview with Charlie Rose on CBS News Night Watch. This was no ordinary conversation. It was a tense face-off between Manson, the cult leader and convicted murderer, and Rose, the sharp interviewer. Manson was infamous for orchestrating the brutal murders of actress Sharon Tate and 6 others on August 8, 1969. Although he didn't physically commit the murders, Manson directed his followers to carry out this horrific act. Manson had been convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder on March 29, 1971, and was initially sentenced to death. However, in 1972, California temporarily abolished the death penalty, and his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Over the years, he was housed in various California prisons, including San Quentin, Folsom, and Corcoran. Known for his volatile behavior, Manson faced repeated parole denials and was a constant source of disturbance within the prison system.
In other words, I have to go into another person and put on another face
I got it.
Play,
I understand. So you say to Tex, you owe me one.
That's right. So then when my brother gets busted and my brother's in jail, then I tell Tex, pay him what you owe me.
During the interview, Manson's behavior was unsettling. His demeanor swung between eerie calm and sudden, intense outbursts. He would often lose himself in long, rambling monologues, veering off topic and making cryptic statements. His piercing stare and bizarre responses made the interview unforgettable. When Rose pressed him about his crimes, Manson deflected with philosophical rants, insisting that he was a victim of the system rather than a villain. He spoke of his traumatic childhood and years in prison, explaining how he felt molded by these experiences into who he became. Raised in a broken home, Manson's life was troubled from the start. Born to a 16-year-old mother, Kathleen Maddox, he was abandoned early on as she was frequently in trouble with the law. By the age of 5, his mother had been jailed for armed robbery, leaving Manson to fend for himself. By 9, he began his own descent into crime, getting his first taste of juvenile detention for petty theft. His time in juvenile centers and reformatories shaped his warped worldview, teaching him skills of manipulation and intimidation, techniques he would later use to control his infamous cult, the Manson family. When Rose raised the Tate LaBianca murders, Manson grew increasingly hostile. He claimed there was no murder and downplayed the brutality by framing it as a holy war, an excuse he often repeated. On that tragic night in 1969, Sharon Tate, a rising actress and the pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski, was murdered along with 4 others. Manson had instructed his followers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to go to the house and kill everyone they found. The group's first victim was 18-year-old Stephen Parent, an unsuspecting visitor who was shot as he was leaving the estate. Inside, the killers encountered Tate, her friend, and celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, writer Wojciech Frykowski, and Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. Sebring was shot and stabbed. Frykowski and Folger tried to flee, but were chased and brutally killed.
Because I got that Confederate sword in the kitchen. Don't invoke me. Do it. Get it done. How do we do it? I don't know. I don't want to be involved in it.
Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was stabbed 16 times, her death marking one of the most horrifying events in Hollywood history. Despite the evidence, Manson refused to take responsibility, insisting that the media had twisted the truth. He maintained that he was a victim too, molded by a brutal system that he claimed had made him the person he became. His twisted justification and cold detachment in the interview left an eerie impression on audiences, revealing a man detached from the horror he had unleashed. On November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, Charles Manson passed away from natural causes at a hospital in Kern County, California. This marked the end of the life of one of America's most notorious criminals. If you think his calmness sends chills down your spine, wait till you hear about Arthur Shawcross.
Some people might say, well, isn't that just an excuse to justify killing?
You believe what you want to believe. I told you how I killed, why I killed. You don't want to believe it? That's up to you.
Arthur Shawcross, the chilling details of another killer story. Arthur Shawcross also come to light in a documentary released in 2008. Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer, gave an unsettling interview, revealing his calm demeanor while speaking about his horrific crimes. His ability to talk about the brutal acts with detachment was what made the interview especially disturbing. Shawcross's killing spree began on April 7, 1972, when he murdered his first known victim, Jack Blake. He assaulted and strangled Blake, leaving his body to be discovered a year later in the woods. Later that same year, Shawcross took his second victim, Karen Ann Hill. Her murder was particularly brutal as Shawcross raped her and shoved dirt and leaves down her throat. Shawcross refused to answer questions about these murders, especially when the interviewer brought up Watertown, New York, where they had occurred. He grew hostile and threatened to leave the interview, demanding no more questions about Watertown. It's possible that the murders involving children affected Shawcross differently, causing him to react more defensively when questioned about them. In any case, Shawcross only served about 15 years for the Watertown murders, as he was paroled in 1987. After his release, he moved to Rochester, New York, where he continued his killing spree and became known as the Genesee River Killer. His rampage between 1988 and 1990 saw at least 12 women murdered, most of whom were sex workers. Shawcross's method was gruesome. He would rape, mutilate, and discard their bodies in remote areas near the Genesee River. Shawcross often tried to explain his violent tendencies by blaming his experiences during the Vietnam War. He claimed that the horrors he saw and participated in during the war deeply affected him, pushing him toward his later violent acts. The interviewer wasn't convinced by his explanation and pointed out that Shawcross seemed to be using the war as an excuse for his actions. Shawcross, however, stood by his story, saying that if people didn't believe him, that was their choice.
Why won't you talk about the two young children?
Stop. It's over. Disconnect.
Is it because you're ashamed of it?
It's disconnect. This is over.
During the interview, Shawcross made several disturbing claims about his time in Vietnam, asserting that he had committed terrible acts like killing Vietnamese women and nailing their heads to trees as a warning to the Viet Cong. However, military records later revealed that Shawcross had never seen combat. He had served as a supply and parts specialist in a non-combat role, with no evidence to support his claims of high kill counts or brutality. It appeared Shawcross was fabricating stories to create a more fearsome image and to justify his violent actions. As the interview progressed, Shawcross grew increasingly frustrated with the repeated questions about Watertown. Eventually, he stormed out, demanding to know why they wouldn't discuss the two young D. He then abruptly ended with saying that it was over and to disconnect. Shawcross would later die in prison on November 10th, 2008, at the age of 63 while serving his sentence at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. His death closed the chapter on a man who had taken 13 lives, but had never fully confronted the true horror of his actions. If you think that was bad, the next serial killer, Ramirez, is about to take this to a whole new level.
You admit to being evil, Richard?
We are all evil in some form or another, are we not?
Richard Ramirez. In August 1985, Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, made a critical mistake that would lead to his capture. While in prison, he agreed to an interview that scared everyone who watched it, including the journalist who spoke with him. Ramirez's cold, unflinching gaze made even the most experienced journalists and law enforcement officers feel uncomfortable. His eyes, often described as lifeless and devoid of empathy, seemed to pierce through anyone who dared to question him. During this interview, Ramirez played a disturbing game of cat and mouse with the journalist. He skillfully deflected questions, giving answers that felt rehearsed and empty. He had a way of making it clear that he was only following a script, which added to the unsettling vibe of the conversation. Despite the fact that Ramirez was believed to be responsible for at least 13 deaths, getting him to admit it proved impossible. When asked about the number of victims, he responded that it would not be improper for him to comment in any regard to that question.
Why on earth would you have hurt those people? Why did you kill those people?
No comments. No comments. I cannot answer that at this time.
On August 30th, 1985, his name and photo were released to the public. The following day, Ramirez was spotted in East Los Angeles. A chase began as he attempted to steal a car, but he was quickly surrounded by a crowd and beaten before the police arrived. Ramirez's crime spree had started years earlier. His first known murder occurred when he raped and stabbed a 79-year-old widow, but that was just the beginning. Over the next year, Ramirez killed 13 people, though some reports suggest the number could be even higher. His victims ranged in age from 9 to 83, and his methods of attack were as brutal as they were varied. He used weapons like knives, guns, tire irons, and even a machete, often torturing his victims before killing them. Many of his crime scenes featured satanic symbols, adding to the fear he spread. When asked why he committed such horrific acts, his chilling response was that he gave up on love and happiness a long time ago, and that he doesn't care to explain that. Ramirez frequently spoke of Satan, claiming that dark forces guided his actions. He believed that everyone was evil in some way, acknowledging his own evil nature while suggesting it was a universal trait. He seemed to enjoy controlling the interview, provoking reactions from the journalist, and even claimed that he was evil, but not 100% evil, as if that made him somehow less guilty.
People in this day and age are brainwashed and programmed like a computer at being nothing more than puppets. This nation, this country is founded in violence.
As the interview went on, Ramirez grew frustrated with the questions. He tried to walk out, even shoving the camera aside. He told the interviewer that he was entitled to his opinion. That's it, and snapped like a twig. His manipulative and dark charisma made him a terrifying figure. His brooding persona, often seen wearing dark clothes and sunglasses, captivated certain individuals. His defiant behavior in court, flashing a pentagram on his palm and shouting, "Hail Satan," only added to the fear and intrigue surrounding him. One of his most notable admirers was Doreen Lai, a freelance magazine editor. After seeing Ramirez on TV following his arrest, Lai became convinced of his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She sent him 75 letters over the years, and their correspondence eventually led to a relationship. In a surprising turn, they got married in a ceremony at San Quentin State Prison, sealing their connection in the most unlikely of places. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, passed away from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. He was still waiting for his execution when he died. Ramirez's final days were spent behind bars, but his legacy of terror remained. In the midst of his years in prison, a chilling interview was released where he attempted to evade the truth about his crimes. Despite the questions from the journalist, Ramirez's attempts to deflect or avoid answering only highlighted his coldness and lack of remorse. The aura was intense in the interview with Ramirez, and do it was for Mark Riebe.
I think these families of these women, they need,
this is over.
They need
That's it.
justice.
Captain, we're done.
Why can't you answer these questions?
I answered your question.
Huh?
You want to get this off?
Why are you running away?
Mark Riebe. Fast forward to November 16, 2017, when Mark Riebe found himself in a tense interview with controversial TV host Piers Morgan. Riebe, convicted of multiple murders, was visibly agitated as Morgan pressed him on the details of his crimes. Riebe attempted to accuse Morgan of manipulating him, and the interview quickly escalated into an uncomfortable confrontation. Riebe's arrogance was evident as he tried to control the conversation, yet Piers Morgan wasn't yielding. The story behind Mark Riebe's arrest dates back to August 6, 1989, when a 29-year-old pregnant woman named Donna Callahan disappeared from her job at a convenience store in Gulf Breeze, Florida. This tragic disappearance ultimately led to Riebe's arrest. In 1996, after the case had gone cold, Riebe's half-brother, William Alex Wells, confessed to an inmate about his role in Callahan's murder. Wells, who was serving a 30-year sentence for an unrelated robbery, cooperated with authorities after the inmate reported the confession. Wells disclosed that he and Riebe had kidnapped Callahan and that Rybe had strangled her in the backseat of their car. He also guided the police to the location where they buried her body.
Special Agent Haley's position about this is that in the 8 cases that I went through in detail...
Keep going with Special Agent Haley. Now, I've done explained to you.
You mentioned him too.
This critical information enabled the police to charge Rybe with murder. Though Rybe initially confessed to the crime, he later alleged that police had coerced his confession. This claim would become the focal point of the Piers Morgan interview. The interview began calmly, with the two men exchanging pleasantries, but it quickly took a darker turn. Rybe misjudged Piers Morgan's persistence. He attempted to discredit the police officers involved, especially Special Agent Haley, who had overseen the case. However, Morgan wasn't convinced and continued pressing Rybe on the evidence against him. In 1998, Rybe was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. While incarcerated, Rybe confessed to killing 13 women along Florida's Gulf Coast, detailing information only the killer would know, lending credibility to his claims. But when Special Agent Haley's name surfaced during the interview, Rybe's temper flared. He grew visibly irritated each time the officer was mentioned.
I see, Mark, I don't believe you. I don't believe you.
I don't care.
I think you are a serial killer.
You're wrong.
The interview reached a boiling point as Piers Morgan confronted Rybe, refusing to relent. Morgan stated that he didn't believe Rybe and accused him of being a serial killer. The tension escalated until Rybe seemed desperate to end the interview. Sensing this, Morgan pressed harder. The confrontation ended in chaos, with Rybe attempting to walk off the set. Morgan demanded justice for the families and questioned why Rybe was fleeing. Yet Rybe only wanted to escape, unable to handle the pressure of facing the truth. Mark Rybe remains incarcerated today, still refusing to fully acknowledge the horror he inflicted on his victims. If the past few cases did not blow your mind, I assure you that Aileen's case will blow.
I'm telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't you get it?
Not everybody is killing 7 people. So there must have been something in you that was getting you to do
You
that.
are lost, Nick.
Aileen Wuornos. In October 2020, Aileen Wuornos sat down for her final interview with renowned documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield, just one day before her execution. The interview started off with a smile, but it didn't take long for Wuornos to slip into a darker, more erratic version of herself. She quickly became agitated, speaking in a disjointed, rapid manner. Her eyes darted around the room, and her tense body language showed that she was constantly on edge. As Nick tried to ask her questions, Wuornos grew increasingly angry, and her responses became more defensive. She claimed that the prison authorities were using sonic pressure to control her mind, trying to drive her insane before her death. Her paranoia was clear, and she accused everyone around her, including the police and media, of conspiring against her. According to her, the authorities had known about her crimes long before her arrest and had allowed her to continue killing for the sole purpose of making a spectacle out of her capture. Throughout the interview, Wuornos's bitterness and distrust were evident. She ranted about how the system had failed her, portraying herself as a victim of a grand conspiracy. With every accusation, her tone grew more venomous, and she became increasingly hostile toward Nick. When he attempted to compare her current statements to her past ones, she snapped at him, angry that he was challenging her.
You changed your story. I'm just trying to...
What are you talking about? Change story on what?
No, about whether it was self-defense or not.
I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to get in depth about my cases, Nick.
She screamed out, yelling that they've changed their story, and she's not going to get into that. Her frustration was clear, and it only added to the tense atmosphere in the room. Wuornos also made several chilling statements throughout the interview, hinting at supernatural retribution after her death. She threatened to return in some form, vowing revenge on those who had wronged her. Her words were laced with rage, showing that she would not accept responsibility for the pain she caused. Instead, she believed herself to be justified, even righteous in her actions. She even mentioned a supposed asteroid that she believed would hit the Earth in 2019 and wipe everyone out, providing her with a strange comfort that those who criticized her would eventually suffer. Growing up, Wuornos had faced constant struggle and abuse, which shaped her into the person she became. Her downward spiral began in 1989 when she started posing as a hitchhiking prostitute along Florida's highways. She began a killing spree that lasted until 1990. Her first victim, Richard Mallory, was a convicted rapist she claimed to have killed in self-defense. Over the next year, she killed 6 more men, each time using a .22 caliber revolver. Her victims were all middle-aged men, and their bodies were discovered abandoned along highways. In her final interview, Warno stood firm in her belief that her murders were not evil. Instead, she saw them as acts of good, a way of cleaning up society by taking out what she believed were dangerous men who might hurt other women. However, as the interview progressed and Nick continued to press her with uncomfortable questions, Warnos lost her patience and demanded the interview end immediately, walking out in anger. She told the interviewer, Nick, that they would have to cut the interview, stating firmly that she wasn't going to provide any more details and was leaving, adding a curt "thanks for nothing." On October 9, 2002, Aileen Warnos was executed by lethal injection. Despite the horror she left behind, her life and crimes continue to captivate people. Warnos was a bit chill, but this next serial killer who's been taking lives across cities was never ready to confess to his crimes.
I'm not angry with her. She hadn't done anything. She was nothing but a great wife.
Lorenzo Gilead. On March 6, 2018, Piers Morgan found himself in another heated and intense interview, this time with Lorenzo Gillard, the notorious Kansas City Strangler. From the very start, it was clear that Gillard was not in the mood for this conversation. As Morgan confronted him with DNA evidence linking him to the murders, Gillard's frustration became more and more obvious. His calm and collected demeanor quickly broke down, and he became visibly agitated. Morgan pressed Gillard on the gruesome details of the murders, which only made Gillard even more defensive. He tried to maintain his composure, but his answers turned evasive, and his patience was wearing thin. Halfway through the interview, the tension hit its peak. Gillard accused Morgan of twisting his words, claiming that the journalist was more interested in sensationalism than in understanding his side. He even hinted that he might walk out of the interview because he felt it was unfair and biased against him.
And that's in 1969, that's how it started. So then after that, whenever in the neighborhoods where I lived in the hood, whenever rapes came up, I guess they come to arrest, see who lived in the neighborhood.
Gillard's history of violence started long before his killing spree. In 1969, he was arrested for assaulting a girl he knew, but the charges were dropped after a reconciliation agreement. The violence didn't stop there. In 1973, he was arrested for assaulting his wife, Rena Hill, who accused him of years of physical and abuse. However, it wasn't until 1977 that Gillard's violence escalated to murder. His victims were often vulnerable women, many of whom were He would lure them, rape them, and then strangle them to death. The brutality and randomness of his crimes terrorized Kansas City, but despite several arrests for other crimes, Gillard managed to evade capture for his murders. His ability to blend into society as an ordinary trash company supervisor allowed him to avoid suspicion for decades. In 2004, advances in DNA technology finally linked him to the murders. By 2007, Gillard was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial revealed the fear he instilled in his victims and the entire community. However, during the interview with Morgan, Gillard's calm and composed behavior was chilling. Despite all the horrific things he had done, he displayed no visible signs of remorse or guilt, sitting there and discussing his crimes without a care, which made his statements even more terrifying. Piers Morgan, no stranger to interviewing criminals, wasn't fooled by Gillard's demeanor. He noted that Gillard often used psychological manipulation, attempting to present himself as a victim of wrongful accusations. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, Gillard denied any involvement, even feigning ignorance about how his DNA was found on the victims. As Morgan persistently questioned him, Gillard's responses became more evasive and frustrated. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense, and Morgan eventually snapped, confronting Gillard more directly. This only made the killer angrier, and he abruptly stood up, demanding to be taken back to his cell. Morgan fired back, asking if Gillard thought he was an idiot, but Gillard merely glared at him with contempt, clearly finished with the interview. After a tense silence, Gillard turned and walked away, leaving Morgan and the viewers with a chilling reminder of what it's like to confront a convicted serial killer. Gillard continues to serve his life sentence without parole, at the Crossroads Correctional Center in Cameron, Missouri.
I'm going to end our conversation now because you're taking things out. You're taking things out of context. I didn't apply that.
I don't think I am taking things out of context. I'm trying to work out what you're telling me.
Even after countless evidence was stacked against him, Lorenzo didn't budge. Tommy Sells did something inhumane.
The first time I did a shot of dope, it was the best feeling I ever had in my life. And the first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush.
Tommy Lynn Sells. On November 17th, 1987, Tommy Lynn Sells brutally beat a pregnant woman to death. This horrifying act became a topic no one dared to discuss, and when it was brought up in a 1999 ABC News interview, Tommy's reaction was chilling. His response grew so intense that he even threatened the interviewer's life. Tommy's life of crime began early. By the age of 13, he was banned from his grandmother's house after a disturbing incident where he crawled into her bed naked. This event caused his entire family to disown him, leaving him alone to survive on the streets. By 14, Tommy was living like a drifter, hitchhiking and hopping trains across the United States. In 1979, when Tommy was just 15, he committed his first murder. He claimed to have killed a man who had given him a ride, marking the beginning of a murder spree that would last for decades and cover several states. Tommy's crimes were violent and unpredictable. He would break into homes and attack his victims with whatever weapon was closest at hand. In 1992, Tommy attacked 19-year-old Fabian Witherspoon.
The first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush. And it was just like that shot of dope. Every time I did it.
However, Fabian fought back and survived, leading to Tommy's arrest for malicious wounding. Despite being sentenced to prison, Tommy's violence did not end. After serving just 5 years, he was released and returned to his killing ways. In December 1999, Tommy broke into the Harris family's home in Del Rio, Texas. He murdered Ken Harris and attempted to kill Crystal C.S. Miraculously, Crystal survived and was able to identify Tommy as her attacker, which led to his capture on January 2nd, 2000. Tommy was convicted of Ken Harris's murder and sentenced to death, yet his most terrifying crime was still to be revealed. In Illinois, Tommy murdered the Dardeen family. He first shot Keith Dardeen, then beat their son to death. He turned on Elaine Dardeen, who was pregnant, and beat her so savagely that she went into labor and gave birth right there on the spot. Tommy didn't stop there. He went on to beat the newborn baby as well. When an interviewer attempted to discuss this incident, Tommy warned him to stay away from the topic. The conversation took a dark turn as Tommy began fantasizing about what he would do to the interviewer if given the chance.
It's just like that drug. I'm after that drug again. I don't have an on and off switch. I'm just after that drug.
He even described how he would kill him, explaining that when his head hit the concrete, it would crack like a coconut. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed on April 3rd, 2014 by lethal injection. Though convicted for only one murder, Tommy claimed to have killed over 70 people, with authorities believing he was responsible for at least 22. Throughout his criminal career, Tommy's behavior and brutal acts terrified everyone around him. His final interview revealed just how disturbed and dangerous he truly was. If you think Tommy Lynn's methods were brutal, let me raise you Richard Kuklinski, literally known as the Iceman.
I don't think so. I got maybe a little excitement. Most of the time, though, after that, I felt disgust that I did it.
Richard Kuklinski. In 1986, Richard Kuklinski, known as the Iceman, was arrested. He became infamous as one of the most feared contract killers in American history. His crimes were horrific, but what made him even scarier was his cold, emotionless voice and the subtle threats he made during his interviews. Richard's journey into crime started with petty theft, but by the 1960s, he was deeply involved in organized crime, working for several mafia families, including the Gambino and DeCavalcante organizations. As he got deeper into the world of crime, Richard's reputation grew for being efficient and ruthless. He became a well-known hitman, someone everyone feared. His methods were terrifyingly varied and brutal. Richard used knives, guns, poison, and sometimes even his bare hands to kill his victims. He didn't care who they were, business partners, rivals, or even friends he believed might have betrayed him.
Difference in any of them. They were all pretty bad. He left his mark on me, pretty much.
In 1985, Richard's reputation reached new levels of infamy when he earned the nickname the Iceman. Authorities discovered that he had frozen one of his victims' bodies to hide the time of death. This gruesome tactic showed just how cold-blooded he could be. He was a master at making his murders look like accidents, or just not leaving any evidence behind. While in prison, Richard gave several interviews, and they were just as chilling as his crimes. He spoke about his murders with a cold detachment, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. In one of the interviews, the interviewer noticed Richard's mood had shifted, and there was a sudden look of anger on his face. Richard's bad temper was one of the main triggers that pushed him to kill. He was easily irritated, and even the smallest thing could set him off. When asked what made him angry during the interview, Richard admitted he didn't like being criticized. The relationship Richard had with his father, Stanley Kuklinski, played a huge role in shaping his violent behavior. Stanley was an abusive alcoholic who constantly mistreated Richard. He physically and emotionally abused him, which created a deep hatred in Richard from a young age. To make things worse, Stanley killed Richard's older brother Florian by pushing him down the stairs. This traumatic event left a lasting mark on Richard, fueling his anger and resentment even further. Growing up in such a hostile environment forced Richard to harden his emotions and develop a tough exterior just to survive. Despite all his crimes, Richard showed no remorse and was open about his violent tendencies. His interviews gave a chilling look into the mind of a man who had no fear or guilt about the people he killed. He lived his life in a world where murder was just a job and nothing. No one was off limits. Richard Kuklinski died in prison on March 5th, 2006, in Trenton, New Jersey. Even in death, he remained a chilling figure in criminal history. If you enjoyed these cases, then make sure to check out our next ones, shown on screen.